All right. So I gave this a very fancy title, Breaking the Mold, RPG Evolution and Paradigm Shifts in Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire. Really what this should be called is, we tried to do some new things in role-playing games. Some of them worked, and a bunch of them didn't. Let's find out how. All right, what in the heck is this talk about? Ultimately, it's a post-mortem for Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire. It's about looking at the assumptions that we made going into the sequel and what proved right about those assumptions and what proved ultimately to be very wrong. For those of you who are not familiar, Deadfire is the sequel to Pillars of Eternity. These are both crowdfunding games that Obsidian Entertainment made. They're for PC. They're party-based isometric role-playing games in the style of Dungeons and Dragons, or of Icewind Dale, Baldur's Gate, and Planescape Torment. They have a Dungeons and Dragons style character development system, so you advance over several levels with different classes, pick various abilities as you go up in level. We use 2D backgrounds with 3D characters and lighting systems, and they were both made in Unity with our own proprietary tools, especially for game data editing and dialogue. What are we going to be talking about? So first, we're going to talk about the feedback that we received on Pillars of Eternity, because the feedback that we received proved to be the foundation for our expectations for the sequel. Some of that was good, and some of it turned out to be very bad. Changes that we made based on that feedback and the reasons for doing so, and how we made those changes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the backer beta, which was fairly short, the launch itself, and what happened after the launch. I'm going to go into some controversial features that we approached during development. Some of these were controversial within the team. Most of them were controversial in the community. But all of them are worth talking about, I think, for the benefit of development in the future. And also long-term post-launch support. 2 weeks ago, marked the 1-year anniversary of Deadfire's launch. We released our 5.0 patch. Obsidian has become very dedicated to doing long-term support for its titles, especially Pillars of Eternity. So we did a lot of post-launch patching and DLCs, and that made a big difference in the long run. A little note here. So I'm going to be talking about decisions that I made that I'm completely responsible for. There were other decisions that were made above my head. It might sound like I'm throwing people under the bus. I am a little bit. But in order to actually do a post-mortem on this and really talk about the decisions that were made and why, I felt the need to sometimes refer to decisions that were made above my head, because that will give you a complete picture of what actually happened during the development process. For those of you who do not know who I am, I'm Josh Sawyer. I'm the studio design director at Obsidian. I started at Black Isle Studios in 1999. I worked there until 2003. I worked on primarily the Icewind Dale series of games, which is one of the inspiration points for Pillars of Eternity and Deadfire. Between 2003 and 2005, I was at Midway San Diego working on a Gauntlet game that did not go super well. Then I went to Obsidian. I've been there since 2005, either as a senior designer, a lead designer, a game director, and now for the past few years, the studio design director. Currently, I am between directing projects. I'm helping on supporting internal teams as a studio design director, and I'm also working on the Pillars of Eternity tabletop role-playing game. I did not expect I would actually ever get a chance to work on a tabletop role-playing game professionally, but now I am, and it's great. So, I'm going to talk about some assumptions that we had going into the sequel. That's Sven Vinka there, by the way. We are in a space with Divinity Original Sin 2, kind of. Sven from Larian is a very great guy. He's a very forthcoming person with any data that he has about the success of Divinity, Original Sin, and Original Sin 2. And one of the things that came up when we were talking with him is he had mentioned that there was actually relatively low overlap between the audiences for Original Sin and Pillars of Eternity, which we thought was kind of interesting. But then again, they are fundamentally different games from a combat perspective, which is a big deal to a lot of people. Divinity games are turn-based. Pillars of Eternity is real-time with pause, because that's what the Infinity Engine games were. Divinity Original Sin to Divinity Original Sin 2, the first game reviewed well, sold very well. The second game reviewed incredibly well, sold phenomenally well. So we were like, well, we reviewed and sold well. So if we have a similar approach to refining the formula of the game, we will review even better and sell incredibly well. Wow. Wrong. That did not happen. But it worked out pretty well anyway. So now we're going to talk about how we looked at these criticisms and tried to move forward. One of the first criticisms, by the way, when I talk about these criticisms, I'm only listing the ones that really seem to come up a lot in user reviews and in professional reviews. There are many, many other complaints that are totally valid that people could make about these games, but these are the ones that kept coming up, and we thought it was very important to try to address them. One of the first is that combat was hard to follow. Again, Pillars of Eternity was a real-time with pause game. When Baldur's Gate came out, it was kind of revolutionary that it used real-time with pause for RPG combat. For most people, it was the first game they had seen that used a system like that. RTSs were very popular in the late 90s, early 2000s. Not very popular right now. So when Pillars of Eternity came out, obviously all the veterans of those games adapted fairly quickly, but there were a lot of people that had no experience with this type of game. The pace of the combat was very fast, and there were a lot of problems that we tried to address. One of the things that we approached was how we rendered visual effects. As you can see from the big mass of color in the middle of the screen, that's a couple of spells going off. What's going on under there? Who knows? That was an experience that a lot of people had playing Pillars of Eternity, where they would cast a spell, it would go off, and then they would say, like, I think someone's dying in there, but I don't know. So we actually changed our rendering pipeline to reduce that visual noise, and it helped a great deal. We have a mechanic in the game called engagement. This is a crowd control mechanic that tanks can use to lock people down. It proved to be very noisy in the original game. You've had a lot of UI feedback that was really confusing to a lot of people. So we made changes to how engagement worked to just reduce that overall clutter. It also helped to make the tank characters a little more distinctive from the non-tank characters. And then the most controversial thing that we did is we moved from a 6-character party to a 5-character party. This was one of the more criticized things in the game because Icewind Dale and Baldur's Gate were 6-character party games, and that felt very traditional to a lot of people. Moving to 5 characters just irritated a lot of people, but ultimately it was an important change for us to make to help make the combat easier to follow. And finally, we had an AI customization system. The customization system really added a lot, both for players. It allowed them to build their own custom AI sets, but it also allowed us to do a lot on the NPC side, the monster side. So for players, it made combat easier to manage because they could automate a lot of things, and for us, it allowed us to make better AI behavior, and that helped a great deal. This is just a contrast right here. This is a typical battle. Actually, that's not a typical battle. That's a big battle from Pillars. And here is a battle from Deadfire. The visual effects rendering changes made a big difference. There's a lot of visual clutter that's gone from engagement and things like that. It did help a lot. Another criticism is that the Stronghold felt very disconnected from the main story. I think that was a totally fair criticism. We included Strongholds because people like Strongholds, and it turned out we didn't have the resources to really integrate them as well as we wanted to. So we decided to make the Stronghold a ship. This was something that we argued about for quite a while. At first, we thought about doing multiple little strongholds all around the archipelago. Ultimately, it seemed like it made more sense to just say, look, you're going to have to travel by ship around the game. Let's just make that your stronghold. It's necessary for traveling, so you're going to keep going back there. It's a convenient place for all of your companions and other little NPC buddies to gather, so that if you want to swap party members out, you're always going to wind up going back to the ship at various points. And it's very appropriate for a pseudo Age of Sail game. Pillars of Eternity is not, it's really not a medieval game. It's more supposed to be an early modern game, 16th century plus. And so going into the Age of Sail felt like a natural progression from the original game, which was early 16th century. Another big criticism is that the Stronghold mechanics are boring. Also, can't argue with that. They weren't that interesting. So we added a ship crew and navigation mechanics. That was relatively straightforward. The crew was an easy place to put NPCs that you found. For example, if you had a quest that ended, an NPC might join your crew as a reward. That seemed like a really cool, neat thing to do. And then we got into the ship-to-ship combat system, which is, again, one of the more controversial things that we added, and we're going to talk about that later. Voiceover was very inconsistent. Pillars of Eternity is a big role-playing game with tens of thousands of lines of dialogue. And it's very expensive, and it's very time-consuming to voice all that dialogue. So we had partial VO for some characters. Almost none of the characters in the game actually had full voiceover. This was not liked by a lot of people. Only the chapter breaks were even narrated, so any of the prose text that we wrote was just plain text that you had to read. Streamers, which were starting to become very prominent in about 2015 when this game came out, they really, really hated seeing a lot of unvoiced text, and it turned a lot of people off from streaming the game, just kind of frustrated people. And right in the middle of Deadfire's development, Divinity Original Sin 2 came out, and it had Fulvio for everything. So that set a new standard. I hate them for it. They did that, though, and we had to respond to it. We couldn't ignore it. And we're going to get back to that, too. There were too many trash fights. Partially my fault. Actually, largely my fault. Does everyone know what a trash fight is? It's a fight in a role-playing game where basically it just feels like it doesn't offer anything tactically or strategically that's different from the fights around it. It feels like a waste of the player's time just to drain their resource. You go through a dungeon and you'll have every square inch is populated by essentially a carbon copy of a fight that you've already seen. There were a lot of these, unfortunately, in Pillars. So in Deadfire, we moved so that blockouts that people did for their levels had to include encounter maps, so we could see where the encounters would be. Documents also had to define those encounters. So for example, if someone said, well, I only have 3 encounters in this level, and then we found out that they were all essentially the same encounter, I'd say cut one of those encounters or change it, or change both of those encounters into something else. But a lot more work went into the upfront design of saying, please don't flood every level with trash fights because the players, they just don't enjoy it. And then encounters received a system design pass. So we have area designers. Area designers know the systems of the game to a certain extent, but the fine-tuning of combat was more on the system design side. So the idea was when an area designer would put an encounter in a level, then we would later have a system designer go through and they would do a pass on tuning that. Unfortunately, there was so much system design work to do that only a small number of encounters received that tuning pass prior to launch, and that turned out to bite us in the ass because the game wasn't tuned very well. The environments felt too static. Again, this game was a 2D game with 3D characters. In Pillars of Eternity, none of the vegetation was dynamic. There wasn't dynamic cloth, really, except for on the characters. The lighting felt a little stilted, and often the shadows and the characters didn't integrate into the background. It got what I would call the Scooby-Doo effect, where you can see the moving characters that feel very separate from everything else in the scene. We approached this in a couple of ways. Some of it was graphical and some of it was behavioral. So we added a new NPC scheduling and behavior system. This allowed characters to sort of have their own lives and routines. It made the environments feel more alive because instead of characters just sort of standing in one place all day long, they had their own routines that they would go through. This was mostly used in cities and things like that, but it was also used for monsters and patrols. And then we did a lot of rendering work. It's funny because once the game got to this point, it kind of just looks like a 3D game now that just has an isometric camera. But that background is actually all 2D, but it has 3D lighting integrated into the 3D characters and everything like that. So we moved to physically based rendering. We moved from Unity 4 to Unity 5. It seemed like a no-brainer to go to physically based rendering and start using various tools to just make everything look a lot better on the character side. We introduced vegetation and cloth physics. All the trees there in the background, those are all dynamic, and they blow with the wind. The wind was a dynamic element that would move cloth and vegetation. It added a ton. A huge amount of work went into unifying the character shadows and lighting into the world so that when characters moved through darkness, they really felt like they were integrated into the environment instead of being separate from them. We added parallax layers. Parallax layers, obviously this is very old technology going back to 8-bit games and even earlier, where you have a scrolling layer in the background or multiple scrolling layers that move at different rates of speed. This is most useful in areas that have great height, where there's a big distance to something down below. It was actually a surprising amount of work to get parallax layers to work given our weird rendering stuff, but it did add a lot in the areas that we used it. And then we had a new water technology. The water in Pillars 1 was basic and functional. We licensed a water technology called Cedo, and then we altered it pretty significantly. It made the oceans look really beautiful so that when you were on the coast or on a ship, which is a lot of the places in the game, the water really looked great. Yeah. So this is a criticism of both games. We did our best to try to reduce them, but it was a very difficult challenge. Load times were very bad. This was especially difficult in areas where you were going in and out of buildings over and over. We switched to a hub-based loading system. So for example, in a city or any area that had a large interior with several interiors, we would take all of the child areas and cache some of the data about those areas so that when you transitioned in and out, that data was already sort of preloaded. That made those transitions in big areas a lot easier. There was a ton of memory that was being taken up and a ton of loading that was happening with Unity data. All of our gameplay data, all of our spells, all of our creatures were in Unity asset bundles. And we would load those dynamically every time we would load into an area. That was very time-consuming and expensive. So we moved all of that out of the Unity editor into our own standalone editor that was using XML or JSON. So it's text. All that stuff would load at the start of the game, and that helped eliminate a lot of the load time as well. And then finally, the save load system was rewritten. This might not seem like that big of a deal, but when we rewrote the save load system, we also reauthored how the save game state was restored. So the first time you'd enter the game, or if you loaded a save game, it would get you into the game much more quickly because it wasn't trying to reset all these variables and do all this crazy stuff. Companion reactivity was bad. I think people liked our companions overall, but there were a lot of places where companions either wouldn't react to each other, NPCs wouldn't react to them, they wouldn't leave the party. It was kind of like, it felt like they were always along for the ride, but they weren't really fully integrated into the game as well as they could have been. Because Obsidian is known for writing, this is something that we felt was very important to address. So right away, we had more in-depth budgeting for writing. What I mean by this is that all the writers sat down and we said, okay, how big are companions going to be? How are we going to break up the writing responsibilities in terms of their hubs, which is their main question node, their interjections in conversations, their banters with each other, the relationships you can have with them, their personal quests. So we broke those down into ranges of nodes. Nodes are the unit of measurement that we sort of talk about when we talk about how much writing there is to do for a character. And we budgeted that very early. We also staged the writing. So on most of the games I've worked on, all the companion writing was done very late in development, usually because we reasoned, oh, well, when it's done very late, then we can react to everything that we've written earlier in the game. The problem was companions are huge, and that's an enormous amount of work. So after we did the budgeting, we also broke up the writing for companions into 3 phases that made the most sense for development. This removed an enormous amount of burden from us because we could focus in each stage of development on a different aspect of companion writing, and it made the tail end of companion writing a lot easier for everyone. We also included companion leave conditions. Companions were no longer going to follow you to the ends of the earth. If you pissed them off, they would get into an argument with you. They might just get up and leave immediately. But they were unique to each character, and it added a lot of sort of depth to them that was lacking in the first game. And then the final thing is that we added a new topic system with reactions and relationship breakpoints. This did not work very well. I think it was a cool idea, and I'm going to talk more about it later. A lot of people criticized that it had a very slow start. Pillars of Eternity had a very slow start, and your motivation was very ambiguous. The main villain of the game was kind of hidden for most of Pillars of Eternity. He was a very cool villain, Theos Ix Arcanon, but exactly why he was doing what he was doing and why you were chasing him was not super clear. So from the beginning of Deadfire, pacing was a priority. The very beginning of the game is your castle is destroyed, and this god breaks his way out, and you're almost killed, and then the god of death holds your soul ransom and says, please go find Aethys, or I'll just snap your soul into nothing. So very clear motivation for why you're doing what you're doing. Aethys, this big dude with the glowing forehead, he is the main antagonist. He's obviously the main antagonist right away. And we did iterate on the pacing a lot. So especially at the beginning of the game, there were a lot of times where we would go and we would cut out small loops. We would cut out nodes of dialogue just to make sure that the introduction to the game was a lot faster and smoother than it was for Pillars 1. The factions were underdeveloped in Pillars 1. For those of you who played Pillars 1, you meet the factions starting at Act 2 in Defiance Bay, And when you leave Defiance Bay, you will never see those factions again. And if you've played something like Fallout New Vegas, the factions are present almost from the beginning of the game all the way to the end. So that was a misstep. Deadfire's factions are there pretty much throughout the whole game. As soon as you get to Mage Island, you meet the Juana, you meet the Principe, or sorry, not the Principe, you meet the Valiant Trading Company. Shortly thereafter, you meet the Principe and then the Royal Deadfire Company. So very early on, you meet all 4 of the factions, and they're there with you almost literally up to the very end of the game. So we did a much better job of including the factions. They're also central to the political conflict of the Deadfire. But that did confuse the plot. This is my fault. I have to take full responsibility for this. So we had this very strong start with Aethys going blam, and then he's, like going across the ocean, and the gods are like, you got to follow that dude. And then as you're following him, there are all these factions that are fighting over the Deadfire. And players, logically, were like, so I'm following that guy? Seems like there's a lot of fighting going on here. Am I supposed to be helping figure out who controls the Deadfire, or how does this tie together? And I didn't do a very good job of actually tying those things together. There were 2 cool plot points that didn't mesh very well. But overall, we did a lot more planning and plotting about what the faction should do. I think that helped a great deal. And every faction had a companion champion. This was extremely important. So all the characters at the bottom are associated with a faction, and they have very strong feelings about that faction's role in the world. Depending on the alliances you make, some of those characters might leave you. For example, Pallegina is extremely sort of hard-ass about being dedicated to the Valiant Trading Company. But it was actually something that a long time ago, Chris Avallone had made a very strong point where he had said, like, you should always have a companion that is a mouthpiece for one of the factions in your game. So we did a better job of that in this game. We did have a backer beta. We had a backer beta on Pillars 1 as well. There are some tricky things about backer betas. It's very limited content, and it's a very limited audience. I think anyone who's done early access also knows that there are dangers to this. For those of you who want to do this type of thing, understand that your audience is self-selected to the most hardcore, enthusiastic people. They give very good feedback, but it is also feedback for psychotic gamers. Like, they have the strongest opinions. They're gonna just grind your game into the dust. It is very valuable, but it can kind of skew your understanding of how your game plays for a wider audience. Also, the longer a beta goes on, it becomes a well-trod path. That content that you put out, unless you're gonna put out a bunch of new content every time you update the backer beta, people are gonna just run that over and over again, and it can lead to a very strange perception of difficulty, for example, or quality of writing, because no writing really seems that great if you've seen it 20 times. So there's a little bit of a problem sometimes with content that gets overused and over-iterated on. For us, we didn't have any companion or story elements in the game. We wanted to keep that under wraps, so we didn't get feedback on that. Also, this is our earliest content, and that's often the worst content, and sometimes it's the hardest to iterate on. I know a lot of times I've worked on a game, and the very first stuff you do, not only is it sort of bad in execution, but when you get under the hood, it's such a mess that if you try to pull out and redo it, it's a problem. So sometimes backers can get the sense that you aren't really doing very much with the content, when in fact it's just hard to do anything with it. It also personally warped my sense of difficulty, because I actually had this opposite effect where, because everyone who was playing the backer beta was really good and aggressive, and they had played it so many times, and they said, oh, this is so easy, I was like, you're just saying that because you're a super crazy gamer, and you've already played this 20 times, I'm sure the difficulty is fine. Wrong. It was not fine. It was actually really easy, which we found out when the game came out. So what we heard in the backer beta, a lot of the new mechanics were confusing or punishing. We did get great feedback on that. We made a lot of good changes based on player feedback. One of the big things is that everyone just moved way too fast. This was also a criticism in Pillars 1 that I didn't really heed as well as I should have. We did slow characters down a lot, just physical movement speed. And the ship-to-ship combat sucked. We're going to get back to that, but people were like, this sucks. And we're like, how about this iteration? That sucks too. How about at the game launch? It still sucks. And there were a lot of technical issues. So it was worth doing. They did really find a lot of stuff, both from a gameplay perspective and also a technical perspective, that helped the final game in the long run. So the game came out. Yay. Wow, I'm not going very fast, am I? Oh, well. So what do we hear? The game is way too easy. There were lots of performance problems. The Fulvio was awesome. Everyone loved it. The main plot was too short, which is sort of true. If you just cruise straight through, it can be a very short experience. The game itself is very big. There were ambiguous stakes in the main plot. Again, there was this confusion between the main plot and the sort of the factional plots. The companion relationship mechanics were crazy and didn't make any sense at all. And a lot of people, we had these minor characters called sidekicks. They weren't full companions. A lot of people, they always want more companions. So we had added these mini companions. We said we can't write we can't write 10 full companions. So here's a couple of minor companions called sidekicks. And people are like, we want them to be full companions. Why'd you include them at all? Which, is questionable. I still think that the game is better for having them, but people did want them to be fully fleshed out. Hey, the ShiptoShip Combat is bad. The reviewer said it was bad. The players said it was bad. So in the short term, after launching, there were a couple things that we couldn't really do anything about. Anything that had to do with the main plot and the villain, that's my fault. That's how I wrote the main plot of the story. There's not a whole lot you can do in the short term to fix, just sort of fundamental structural issues with the game and the story. Ship-to-ship combat, we did make changes to the UI. We made balance changes that helped. Again, though, fundamentally, people who didn't like the system just were never going to like it. The companion relationships seemed all over the place. The tuning was really crazy. So we did some tuning. We did some new tagging of relationships. I'll go into that. The most important thing I think we did is that we displayed a record of changes between your companions' relationships, because a lot of times people would get to a point where they'd say, like, why do these characters hate each other? I have no idea why. So the companion relationship page would actually show all of the steps that had led to that point. There wasn't any silver bullet for performance optimizations. We did what we could, but we found that in a lot of cases, our AI, especially in big areas like Nakataka, the main city, was just really atrocious. There wasn't an easy way to split those levels up. We didn't want to pull a lot of NPCs out and potentially screw things up, so that was difficult to deal with. And then difficulty, there were two things that we did. If we found what I call the tall blades of grass, we would cut those. So people hate this. Everyone knows that people hate this, so do it as early as possible. If there's one character build that is just ludicrously powerful and like 9 out of 10 people use it because it's just such a joke, while at the same time saying, I hate how easy this game is, nerf that build. Very quickly, just change it, cut it out as quickly as you can. The other stuff that we did is we started doing all the encounter tuning that we should have done earlier. So now we're going to talk about controversial features. The 5-character party. Again, we had feedback that combat was hard to follow. Larger parties usually mean that there are more enemies in the battle. Makes sense. Pillars characters are more active than characters in Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale, on average. Characters like fighters and rogues and rangers in the old Infinity Engine games didn't have a whole lot to do. In Pillars, potentially, they have a lot more to do. That means that you're spending a lot more time managing every character. We found that our UIs were cramped by in the HUD area and in the inventory. They were really cramped by having 6 characters. Also, we followed the same sort of approach that Baldur's Gate and Torment did, where you start with a main character and you add more characters over time. One of the struggles with a system like that is that you have to work very hard to keep the player's attention with regard to pacing. You're starting with one character doing a very small number of things, then you have 2, then you have 3, then you have 4, then you have 5. As you're getting more characters, they're advancing in levels, and they're getting more things to do per character, so it is this really crazy explosion of potential maintenance that you have to do. So this is a big challenge. In Pillars of Eternity, you would usually get Adair as your first companion, followed shortly by Aloth, or vice versa. The last companion most people got was Sagani, and because she was a ranger, she actually added 2 characters, so your party was 7, which was just a lot to manage. And a lot of times we heard people give feedback. They said, I always forgot about one character. There was always one character in a battle that I just forgot what they were doing. They were just auto-attacking over in a corner, like shooting their wand or whatever, and that didn't seem great. So implementing this was actually really easy. We were already planning on reskinning the HUD and UI anyway. Lowering the party limit was not hard. The battle sizes came down. We had fewer enemies per fight because there were fewer characters to fight against. And with all the other changes that we had made based on previous feedback, the combat did become a lot easier to follow. The reception to this, a lot of people grumbled about it. Grumbling, though, here's the thing. It's okay. Like, if someone's like, that's dumb, I don't like it, but they're not like really angry, if it actually is making a good change in the game, just do that. Just keep going. There were some people that really, really, really were mad, like, I'm not playing this game if it has fewer than 6 characters, which is, you know, a weird thing in this world to be that mad about, but there were some people that really didn't like it, and that's just how they felt. The logic was like, well, Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale had 6-character parties, ergo, and Pillars 1 had a 6-character party, ergo, kind of ignoring the fact that we had received all this feedback like, whoa, this is a lot to manage. Overall, people said that the combat was easier to follow. So would I do it again? Yeah, probably. I mean, a lot of it depends on the way your combat is structured. If we didn't have real-time with pause combat, maybe 6 characters are fine, maybe 10 characters are fine. Go play some Battle Brothers, get 12 characters in there, you know, like who cares? You could have huge battles if you really want to, but a lot of it depends on the context, but for this game, I would totally make the choice again. The companion relationship mechanics. I'm going to dive a little bit into the weeds here just because there's a murky system here that was very confusing and frustrating for people. What are you talking about? The companion relationship mechanics. So the way that companions would change their relationship to you and to each other was largely through the system called topics. So you see these little icons around Pallegina here. They represent things like being pro-Valiant Republic or pro-animancy or anti-religious. These are things that she likes. She likes people that are anti-religious. She likes people that say animancy is cool. Every time a character says something that's tagged with that topic, she goes, yeah. And there's sort of like a procedural, not an emote, but basically a reactive line where Pallegina's like, yeah. And then her reputation goes up with that character. And then over time, that builds toward a breakpoint, either positive or negative. And then once you hit that breakpoint, you know, there's an emotional sort of explosion. The character is like, I think you're awesome. Thanks for being so great and hating religion. Or they say like, you know, like, I love you. You're the best. And then you as the player can either interact with that or just say, sorry, I don't want to deal with it. Which actually a lot of people did. There were certain conflicts where players would just kind of like back away and let things take their course. So what problem was I trying to solve? I believe that there is a space between doing purely hand-scripted reactivity for characters and things that feel more topical, and I don't want to say procedural, but a little more mechanically driven. If you look at something like Fallout 4, you have companions that will react to things like picking locks or stealing, which are sort of devoid of context, and that's mechanically driven. On the other hand, if you have a thing where characters only respond to very specific lines that every character says, that's a lot of work, and it feels very special casey, like you have to take certain routes through the game to hit a certain breakpoint with a character. So what this was trying to do is say, hey, there are all of these topics that people talk about throughout the world. Let's use the fact that the player makes hundreds of dialogue choices that sort of intersect these topics, and companions make tons of offhand comments, and use that to do mechanical work behind the scenes so that the player will feel that it's a more organic way of building a relationship. So that when two characters decide that they're buddies or they hate each other's guts, the player's like, makes sense because every time this character keeps saying something that's anti-religious, this other character keeps going until they just explode and go crazy. And the player's like, yeah, I saw that happening. Makes sense. So the implementation was actually really easy. The mechanics of this were very straightforward. But the designers had a difficult time really understanding it. Part of that is because I designed a system that was probably one layer of complexity beyond what it needed to be. It had a lot of adjustability and fine-tuning that ultimately proved to be very difficult to wrap your head around. Tuning was very difficult for a number of reasons. So again, the goal of this is to produce something that feels natural and organic. So that's a feeling. And trying to get that result with a mechanical system can be very tricky. How nodes are tagged is arbitrary. For example, anti-religious. What counts as anti-religious? That's a subjective thing. Racist. What counts as racist? That's also a subjective thing. We also had strengths to that. This is a minor racist comment. This is a major racist comment. Two different designers could interpret those very differently. So that resulted in a lot of ambiguity between those things. The values on individual topics were largely arbitrary. So you'd say like, well, this topic comes up about 15 times in the game, so it's 8 points per thing. This topic comes up 5 times, so it's 20 points per instance. That was done for flexibility, but ultimately it was just very difficult for people to wrap their heads around. An organic system is hard to test. That's part of the point, is that if you take a different route through the game, you can arrive at that relationship through a different way. And what feels good is ultimately subjective. So someone might say, yeah, this feels totally great. And another person might say, this feels completely rushed or fast, or why is it taking so long for this character to react to the choices that I've made? So the reception, not good. This did not go well. There were lots of behaviors that were just way out of whack. Aloth was one of them. Aloth came across as this super critical, like he was constantly frowning and like being mad about almost everything you did. And it was because his topics were marked very correctly, but the instances of that were just so frequent that you were just constantly seeing Aloth like fret about everything you did, which was not really the intention. And then the other one that came up is that Shodi and Pallegina had these like terrible conflicts. Shodi is a priestess. Pallegina hates the gods and all religion. And there were a couple of places where you could like have Shodi in your party, get Pallegina, and then go into her hub and be like, tell me about yourself, Pallegina. And she's like, well, I hate the gods. Also, I think all priests are stupid morons. They're complete idiots. And like, bing, 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 bing. And so over and over again, Shodi is just like going crazy. And then after 5 minutes of going through Pallegina's hub, you could exit, and Shodi would immediately explode on this person that she met 5 minutes ago. That was not intended, but that's how it worked. So the goal is to be more organic and natural, but these failures felt especially artificial. They felt like really, really bad, so it was the complete opposite of what I had wanted. Would I do it again? Only if I simplified the system. I do think that there is a cool thing that was going on there, but it was just too complicated for people to use. It's entirely my fault. I did want to try a new system. I think we learned important things from it, and it could be valuable in the future if it were tuned much better. Ultimately, I feel like sometimes you have to go too far to know where the limit is. I found it. Now we're going to talk about ship-to-ship combat. This is very controversial. This is the UI for ship-to-ship combat. So instead of having like a thing on the open seas where ships would fight, when two ships encountered each other, you would do this turn-based minigame that was abstracted. You had your ship position relative to the other ship at the bottom. You had turns that went in sequence. This was very abstract. This is very board gamey. Also very disliked by a lot of people. I thought it was fun, but I could tell that a lot of people were not going to like it. As soon as the ship became the Stronghold, I remember very clearly, I said, hey guys, let's not turn this into the pirate game, and that is exactly what it became. So it's a ship minigame where you maneuver around and blast each other. It seems very logical. I have a ship. There are other ships sailing around. I should be able to shoot cannons at them. Okay, I guess that makes sense. It's a cool idea, maybe for some people, if you like this style of presentation. A lot of people really did not. So how do we implement this? It really is a full game within a game. Like we could have had like a whole indie dev studio just make this game. It seems very simple, but there is like so much stuff going on in it. It's a ton of stuff. It really could just be a game on its own. Not a very fun game for a lot of people, but a game. It took us a huge amount of resources to get to alpha. Feedback was very negative on the team. They were like, we don't like this. There were a couple people that did. I actually thought it had promise. Even more resources went into the first iteration on it, and the feedback was still extremely negative. So at that point, I said, goodbye. This feature has to go away. It's quicksand. If you've been in development long enough and you see like people just keep marching into this pit and disappearing, and then you just keep sending more people into the pit, and nothing's getting better, that's quicksand. It's a quicksand feature, and so I cut it, and my boss brought it back as a crowdfunding goal. This is where throwing people under the bus happens. I said, hey man, I think this is going to be really expensive and really difficult, and I don't think a lot of people are going to like it. But he brought it back as a crowdfunding goal, and so we were going to do it. It was the most expensive feature in Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. In terms of dev time and money spent, it was a drain on every department, especially testing, but every other department had to contribute to it. It never really seemed to satisfy players. I think this was the thing, is that there were players that really liked it. I liked the system. I thought it was pretty fun, but there was a big portion of our players who were like, I hate the whole system. They hate the presentation. They just hated the whole thing. Quicksand. Yeah, it always seemed to need more stuff. So the reception to this was technically mixed, because again, there were people that really did like it. Most people hated it. Lots of reviewers. It was the most criticized feature in the game. It was a very abstract system with limited mechanics. Would I do it again? No way. Like, again, it's not that I don't think that it's not that I personally don't think it's fun. It's just that for something that most players will have to engage with, knowing that many of the people playing the game were never going to like it, I would not do it again. Because ultimately, this is the fantasy we needed to deliver on, which was deck-to-deck combat. We already had that. Remember this? This is what we showed players you'd be doing. You would be shooting people in the face at point-blank range. Like, I did really want to get tentacles attacking your ship. I never got that, so sorry about that. But ultimately, fighting on the deck of the ship, that's what we essentially showed the player that we were going to do, and that's what we needed to do. The ship-to-ship stuff, I think, just wound up being a lot of time. Full voiceover. All right, I'm rushing through these guys. So as I said before, Divinity Original Sin 2 set a new standard. We had a lot of internal debate about Fulvio. I thought it was too late because it was halfway through development, and we did not start off thinking that we were going to be able to that we were going to do full VO. We were going to do a lot more VO, but not full VO. I was the only person really on that team that had previous experience working on a game with full VO, which was Fallout New Vegas, and that was 65,000 lines of dialogue, and it was a ton of work. So what I said is, let's do full VO in the early game and not do side characters in the later game. Let's sort of hedge our bets and manage that. I was overruled at the owner levels. Owners believed that we really, really, really needed full VO. So we did it. Full VO implementation, Critical Role came on to do the major character voices, which was very, very cool. When we had to do prep, that was with 2 production milestones left. So people were going, hey, why aren't the writers writing anymore? I'm like, because they're recording VO. And that takes all of their time for a game that has, again, tens of thousands of lines of dialogue. We were recording across 3 time zones, including 2 a.m. recording sessions, which were very, very bad. If people missed sessions, either due to being very sleepy or overlapping, we would get casting and recording errors, and then we would need pickups, or we'd have to just live with bad VO. Initially, the owners would not move the schedule. I will go on record here as saying this was the most intense personal pressure I've ever had on a project, and that includes shipping Fallout New Vegas in 18 months. So this was extremely, extremely fatiguing and draining. Took me to the breaking point. This was very, very difficult to get through. Eventually, the schedule was pushed by 2.5 months. We needed that. There was just no way we were going to get the game done without that extra time. So we did get that extra time, and we got through it. How did it go over? It went over very well. People loved it. Streamers, reviewers, players loved it. Critical Role added a huge amount. Is this a hard limit? Am I going to die if this timer runs out? I guess I'm going to find out. Would I do it again? Absolutely not under these same circumstances. Even knowing how much full VO added to the game, knowing that we were not going to get the extra time initially, I would never do that. It was extremely demoralizing for the narrative team. And it put everyone under a huge amount of stress. I would still advocate the same partial VO solution. With proper time, yes, because now it's an expectation, which kind of sucks, but that's what it is. Oh my God, my time's up. Post-launch, the DLCs. Seeker Slayer, Survivor, Beast of Winter, and Forgotten Sanctum. I think the DLC teams did a really fantastic job. These games are much more focused than the original game. Awesome teamwork. They did an awesome job. I just want to call out all the work that they did as being very, very, very good. There was internal debate about doing a big expansion versus 3 DLCs. Owners wanted to do 3 DLCs, so that's what we did, or rather what the expansion team did. It was better than doing the split expansion like on the first game, but it was still very stressful. doing 3 DLCs on a tight schedule is very hard. Lots of overhead for every single launch. Because if you do 3 DLCs in a row, you're essentially launching 3 products, and then you're supporting each one of them as you go on. All right, in the long term, difficulty. We made lots of balance changes over months and months and months of time. We also tuned almost every crit path and major side area in the game encounters. That's work that should have been done early on. We added God challenges. These are optional gameplay modes that made the game more difficult. For example, Mogren's challenge made it so that you had limited time to pause the game. And in turn-based mode, which we added later, your turns would actually run out and just skip. The Bareth God challenge, any character knocked out for more than 10 seconds would die. So these are pretty significant gameplay challenges. We added 11 overall, and then an ultimate that wrapped it up. That was very cool. We continued iterating on the ship UI. We did actually include narrative changes to explain some of the narrative shortcomings. These were included in the 5.0 patch. I think people have received them very well. Again, it's my fault that it wasn't clear to begin with, but we did try to address it in the long run. And then finally, those sidekicks, those minor companions, they did each get expanded into sort of a mini companion with the DLCs. Again, I have to thank the DLC team for doing great work here. Edwin, Constantine, and Facina each got expanded into a mini companion with their expansions, or with their DLCs. The biggest thing that was added post-launch that made the biggest difference overall was turn-based combat. This was a thing that we didn't do from the beginning because the Infinity Engine games are real-time with pause. But about 1 billion people bought Divinity Original Sin 2, so let's give it a whirl. This was not my idea. This was the idea of Nick Carver working with a programmer named Brian McIntosh. I initially resisted it because it did not accurately preserve the action economy of the real-time with pause combat system. The real-time with pause combat system was based on seconds and tenths of seconds, and the turn-based system that they could implement reasonably couldn't sustain that. It had to kind of break the action economy. But I realized that it was an argument of perfect versus good. Yes, we could not faithfully adapt the original system, but tons of people who were turned off by the real-time with pause combat would be drawn into the game, even with an imperfect implementation, so we did it. By far the most significant implementation or thing that we added to the game. This was, don't get me wrong, this was a lot of work, but compared to things like the ship combat system, this was like nothing. Like, this was a very sort of straightforward implementation. There were lots of bugs to work out, but the reception to it was almost universally positive. It was a great thing for us to add. And we added it, 9 months or so after the game launched, and people responded very well to it. All right, I actually made it through. So some lessons learned here. We made some assumptions about real-time with pause and turn-based combat that maybe don't apply anymore. It's not the late 90s, early 2000s. I know somebody's going to read this and say, oh my God, Obsidian's never going to make a real-time with pause game again. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that I've always personally really liked turn-based games. I think we're now finding that there are audiences that also really appreciate them. I think the fact that our turn-based mode was received so well means that we don't have to just constrain the Pillars series to doing real-time with pause combat in the future. Don't make any assumptions about that. But it's just to say that turn-based is a totally viable thing that we can do now. Easier difficulties are very important, but hardcore RPG players, they really do need a challenge when the game launches. Keep in mind, the first people to buy the game are the ones who are most excited about it. Often they're the most passionate. They played your backer beta, they played early access, all that stuff. So if the game is not challenging, it's going to be really, really disappointing. I'm not saying to make the game incredibly difficult for everybody, but if you neglect the difficulty too much, as I did, it can bite you in the ass, and that's not good. When you see a quicksand feature, you'll know them when you see them. You just see resource after resource going to them. Try to cut them as soon as possible. Fight like hell to get rid of them because they're quicksand. They will just consume resources until the game launches. And ultimately, if they don't really work well with your design, it's not going to be a good fit. And unfortunately, I would say now the expectation of Fulvio is now very real in these games. It's not just because of Divinity, it's also because of us. We contributed to it. I actually saw reviews of Owlcat's Pathfinder Kingmaker, where all these people were going like, why doesn't this have full BO? This is such BS. Deadfire and Divinity Original Sin 2 have full VO. Owlcat was working on a much smaller budget, and it's kind of a ridiculous expectation, but now it has become this expectation where players just think that everything will have full VO. It sucks. I don't really know what to do about other than to plan. Full VO in a big game is extremely expensive. And it takes so much time. You have to lock your dialogue so much farther in advance than you're expecting to. And I mean, again, I think it was 62,000 lines of dialogue for Deadfire. Like, it's a logistical nightmare. So if you go down that road, just understand that you're going to have to plan a lot for it. And ultimately, again, the plot should have been about one struggle, not two. We had two very cool, neat ideas that didn't really quite converge. Entirely my fault. But lesson learned. Also, I should probably direct a different type of game next. I mean, I've worked on Icewind Dale 2, Neverwinter Nights 2, and then Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. These are all party-based, fantasy, real-time with pause games. I'm a little burned out on them. Deadfire was, again, the most stressful sort of directing experience I've had so far. So hopefully the next thing I direct will be a little bit different, and then maybe I still like these games a lot, but I need some time and perspective to come back to them. You can burn out. You can burn out on directing the same type of game over and over again, and then you're not really doing good work because you're just burned out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Is there question time?
Perhaps one or two, if it's all right.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for the great lecture.
Thank you.
I was wondering, because a year ago I was also working on an RPG game, and it was a big game. And I was wondering, how many times have you actually played the game from beginning to the end, like in one save file? Because I actually never did it.
So I think it's important, personally, because I'm director and often the lead designer, I always try to play through the game at least once from beginning to end. Every game that I've worked on in a significant capacity, I've always played through the whole game with one character the whole way through. I think it's very important to get that experience. On Deadfire, I had one full playthrough and 3 half playthroughs, I think, total. So one of the problems is that Deadfire is an enormous game. There's also some debate, I think, which is a separate topic. Should directors design content, or should they purely just play the game and give feedback? I want to work on the game. Like, I also want to make things in the game. So, like in Pillars 1, I did almost all the system design. On Pillars 2, I did some system design. I was the co-narrative lead with Carrie Patel, but I also then played the game and gave feedback. It's a difficult balancing act, but I think if a person has responsibilities on the game, it's very difficult unless the team leadership makes time to play the game. So one thing that we did do a little bit better on Pillars than on Deadfire was we had team play days. And they're enormously valuable for getting people's eyes on the game, because sometimes you're so deep in implementation, you just have no idea what's really going on. So, but the thing is, people can't, I mean, they can make time on their own, but that's a lot to ask of people. Usually what we try to do is schedule time for people to play through the game so they get more exposure to it. It ultimately makes the game better in the long run.
Okay, I think we have to end here. So,
all right.
to prepare for the next speaker, right?
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.